Welcome to Fisher Webinars. The following is a recording of Understanding Competitiveness with Viability Benchmarking, originally presented on Thursday, December 4, 2014.
Today's webinar will discuss viability benchmarking, which is a very good tool to understand competitiveness. In this webinar, define what a viability benchmarking is. We'll briefly look at how Fisher determines or does viability benchmarking, and then spend most of the time on identifying where the risks are in the paper industry, and then how do we combine those risks with viability benchmarking so that we are better prepared to address those risks as they come. Most of us in paper industry, at least in North America, probably saw this news headline. Verso Paper Company in October announced that they're going to shut down their Bucksport mill, and that is going to reduce the coated groundwood paper production capacity by approximately 350,000 tons. Obviously, the closure is going to result in lots of jobs in the area. It'll have an financial impact on the company's bottom line. So the question for us is, was the Bucksport closure predictable? So let's quickly use a tool to see how the Bucksport stacks up in the viability benchmark. And here we are looking at the coated groundwood machines in North America. It is very important to define your peer group before you do any kind of a competitive analysis. And in this case, we are assuming that the market for coated groundwood is North America, only US and Canada. So there is no significant import or export. So here what we see is the three machines at Bucksport, number 1, number 4, number 5, they're all in the high risk category, and number 1 and 4 are the highest risk. If we roll this up to a mill level where we combine all machines at a particular mill site, then we see the same thing, that the Bucksport mill as a mill is the riskiest among all mills that make coated groundwood paper in North America. So yes, it was predictable using the Fisher's viability benchmarking. So obviously at Fisher, we'd like to pat ourselves on the back to being able to do that. But let's look at what is a viability benchmarking, how exactly it is determined. Obviously, it's a sophisticated tool to understand current and future economic health of companies, mills, and production lines. And it uses a lot of data. So we look at the data for the closed machines and the operating machines, and then model the data to analyze competitiveness. And once you do that, then it can be a measure of economic health of machines or mills, or competitiveness within the peer group, or identify the machines at risk of shutting down, or a long-term survival of a machine or a mill. So when you look at the data, obviously you need to determine what type of data that you have to use in order to do the viability benchmarking. So before we look at that, this is how a typical Fisher curve looks like, where on the y-axis would be the viability index, where 10 is the highest risk, 0 is the lowest risk. So the lower the number, more competitive the mill is. And it's a bar graph where the width of the bar is proportional to the production of the machine. So it is this particular graph is for a peer group, which is uncoated free sheet machines in North America. So it is interesting to note that the wider bars are in the low risk category and the narrower bars are in the high risk category, and which goes along with the common wisdom that this is an economy of scale. So especially for the commodity grades, the larger or the bigger machines are likely to be more competitive, and that's what we see here as well. So what kind of data that we look at to determine the viability? Number 1 is obviously the cost. That's the first item. Production cost is the first item anyone would look at to determine the competitiveness. And that is true for the current competitiveness as far as selling the product. But when you look at a viability of a machine or a mill, especially long-term viability, then you need to look at not only the cost, but you also need to look at a few other factors. And the factors that we use are the size, which is the production rate of the machine, typically expressed in tons per day. Technical age of the machine, this is the original age when it was installed, adjusted for all upgrades since initial installation. So obviously, older the machine, the risk is going to be higher. And quite often, paper companies think in terms of upgrading the machine or a mill to bring it to a current state of the art in technology. So what kind of capital that would be required to rebuild the line of the mill to a new condition compared to other lines making the same product. So in this case, we're looking at the condition as the other competitors have. And so that found to be a useful factor. Other factors that are important as well are the grade risk. There are some grades that are inherently at a higher risk as compared to other grades because of there's a decline in the market or there's a growth in the market. And we'll see more of that later in this webinar. Internal company risk is important, especially for larger companies that have multiple machines making the same grade of paper. So when they make a decision as to which machines to close, obviously they are comparing within the company at the same time comparing with the competitors as well. And then there's a manufacturing competitiveness for a country. In some countries, the infrastructure is much better, so overall the industry is better, and you can use that as another factor. And the last and not the least, but very important, is a tons per inch trim. And this has been used by paper industry for a long time to measure a machine efficiency or a machine product. So given all these factors, we can do a viability analysis. In this instance, the 8 factors that I mentioned are listed here, and then the viability index for each of those factors calculated for this particular machine. And that's the average risk number, but that is determined based on the weightage given to each of these factors. So all factors do not have the same weightage, and that weightage is determined by a statistical analysis of closed and operating machines. And so we've done that by taking the data for the machines that are closed in the last few years and the current operating machines and do a significant statistical analysis to come up with factors such as this, and that helps us determine what the average risk factor is. And obviously, one can always look at the individual risk factors for individual parameters. Okay, so that's briefly how Fisher does viability analysis. Now, let's look at where the risks are in the paper industry. In order to do that, you really need to look at by grade. And this is one illustration or one guide to sort out the grades. Here we listed our perception of the grade risks are by various regions. So kraft pulp is a high demand product, and its risk is very low in terms of the demand. The printing and writing grades, such as a newsprint or a coated groundwood, uncoated free sheet, they are higher risk, and the risk may vary by region. And here I have Asia Pacific, Europe, Latin America, and North America. These are the 4 major regions where there's a production in all these grades. So by grade, the risk may vary. The consumer tissue and towel, that's the growth area for paper industry, and so that's where the grade risk is very low by itself. So when you look at where the risks are, you really need to look at by individual grades. And let's do that for a few of these listed here. We started with the coated groundwood machines. There was the Bucksport machine closure. So we ask a question, if there's a risk for machines in North America, is there a risk for this grade in Europe and Asia Pacific? Well, this is what we saw for North America. If we look at Europe and Asia Pacific, this circle here indicates where the Bucksport machines are in terms of the risk. So if we compare the mills or machines in Europe, then we see there are at least half a dozen mills that we can identify that would be at risk of closure if the demand for coated groundwood in Europe declines. And it is conceivable that if it does in North America, it will probably do that in Europe as well. But obviously, that regional factor comes into picture, and that's the first thing you need to identify, the demand for the product is. So if that is the case, then we can clearly see that we have a few machines at risk of closure in Europe. In Asia Pacific, the grade risk is not very high, but still the machines that are not competitive, and here I see at least 3 machines, 2 fairly small, that may be at risk of closure if the demand for coated groundwood decreases in Asia Pacific. So this is one way to know something about the grade, the demand for the grade in the marketplace that the grade is sold, and then combine the viability to determine where the risk is in terms of the machines or the mills. Let's look at newsprint. Now, this grade has been in decline for a long time, so it continues to be at risk. And North American paper companies have been very aggressive in terms of shutting down paper machines. So we don't see too many machines in North America that would be at a high risk of closure. But in Europe, there are still significant number of machines that are at risk. There's a decline in Europe similar to North America in the newsprint. To confirm that conclusion, UPM last month announced that they're going to shut down 2 newsprint machines, one in France, one in UK, and this is the one in France, paper machine 3. So that shows up as a very high risk machine. And similarly in Asia Pacific, if there's a decline in newsprint demand, then the ones that are less competitive are the ones that would be at risk of closure. So in case of UPM, there's another analysis one can do is they announced shutdown of 2 machines. So the internal company risk would be good to analyze in case of UPM. So in this case, I define the peer group as newsprint machines in Western Europe, and not Europe as a whole, but the Western Europe, and hopefully that's appropriate enough to do the analysis. UPM currently has 10 newsprint machines in various countries of Western Europe, and the 2 that are scheduled to shut down, this is the one in France, the one in UK, and obviously both of them rank at the high end of the risk as compared to the other machines in the company. So this is another way one can use it within a company in terms of if company decides that they're going to decrease their capacity, then how they're going to decide on which ones. In absolute scale, this particular machine does not have a very high risk, but within a company, obviously, now they must have concluded that's a high risk. Again, this is a peer group, that's the newsprint machines in Western Europe. Maybe need to narrow that down a little more, depending upon what the distribution pattern is for the newsprint in Western Europe. Okay, the next grade, look at kraft pulp. Obviously, this grade by itself has very little risk associated with it, but the kraft pulp quite often is marketed globally. There's a lot of export from various countries. So if you look at Asia Pacific, Europe, Latin America, and North America, there are a number of mills. And Latin America in the last few years, companies there established themselves as the strong competitive producer of market pulp. And we can see here that they have very few mills that are at a high risk in terms of viability as compared to mills in North America or in Europe. Now, to stress a point again that whenever you do the viability, it is very important that you identify your peer group very properly, what the competition is. So in case of a kraft pulp, the minimum you have to do is divide it into hardwood and softwood. And mainly because the availability and applications are totally different based on whether it's a hardwood kraft pulp or a softwood kraft pulp. So let's look at the hardwood. And here we can see that Latin America is the largest producer of hardwood kraft pulp in the world. And the few other large mills that we see in Asia Pacific, they are mainly in Indonesia. So they're all in the tropical region. And they all seem to be very competitive. That means the smaller machines, even in Latin America, definitely in North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific, are at risk in terms of just competitiveness. Even though there is a demand for market pulp, any variations in the pricing or revenue, the ones that are not competitive enough will see a closure, not being operated for a longer term. Okay, tissue and towel is a growth grade for paper industry. It's probably one of the bright spots for the paper industry in terms of increase in demand. So is there really risk in tissue and towel industry? Well, the risks are different, not necessarily shutting down a paper machine or a paper mill, which may be there if it's not competitive, but the risk may be in terms of the raw material used by tissue and towel mills. So here I'm looking at 3 regions, Asia Pacific, Europe, and North America. And tissue entitlements either use recycled paper as their furnish or use market pulp as their furnish. There are some that make their own pulp and use it internally, so you can group them under market pulp. So here what we see is in Asia Pacific, almost 80% of the production relies on market pulp and only 20% relies on recycled paper. In North America, the percentage is about 60-40. In Europe, it's something in between. Now, what's going to change here is the overall economics of market pulp and recycled paper. As more mills come online for hardwood kraft pulp in Latin America or in Indonesia or similar places, there's going to be a greater supply of market pulp, there'll be an economy of scale, and the prices may come down. So there is a possibility for something like that happening. For the economics of recycled paper, for a tissue entitlements, it costs substantial amount of money to process recycled paper for cleaning, screening, de-inking, bleaching, and the yields are low. So I mean, there are a lot of waste that got to be spent money and efforts to dispose it off. So there are significant costs associated with using recycled paper for tissue entitlements. For market pulp, it can be just brought in and used right away on a machine. So in addition to the processing, obviously the mill has to make investment in terms of using that recycled paper. So when you look at that overall economics, it is possible that it may change over time and market pulp may become a lot more competitive as compared to the recycled paper. Another risk here is, where does the recycled paper come from for tissue entitlements? All the fiber that gets used in the tissue entitlement is gone forever. It does not come back into the recycle stream. So the most common grades for the sourcing of recycled paper for tissue entitlement are the printing and writing paper grades. And since the market for that is on the decline, that means the supply of the recycled printing and writing paper is also going to decline over time. So that in turn will make the recycled paper more expensive to buy for most of these mills. So that's a risk factor, that market risk factor that needs to be taken into account. And once you do that, then you look at the viability of the mills. In this case, looking at the mills that use recycled paper as a furnish. And then here we have a number of mills in various regions that may be at high risk if they rely solely on the recycled paper as a furnish. Okay, if you look at the tissue entitlements using market pulp as a furnish, then they, depending upon what the price of the market pulp is, they may have a lower risk if that turns out to be more competitive over a longer time frame. Okay, let's look at another grade, container board mills. This is a linerboard and corrugating medium. All of this gets into the packaging, and here we have the same kind of risk in terms of the raw material source, recycled paper or use of chemical pulp. And the picture is opposite, where in Asia Pacific, 80% of the mills use recycled paper, only 20% use, or 20% of the production is from the chemical pulp. In North America is more like 60-40, and Europe is somewhere in between. But looking at just the size of it, you can see that the Asia Pacific is the largest producer of container board. Now, the economic here is always in favor of recycled paper. So all mills will continue to use recycled paper because chemical pulp will probably not be able to compete with recycled paper simply because it does not have to, it's a brown fiber, does not have to be processed as extensively as tissue and towel mills. There's no de-inking or bleaching required, and the yields are reasonably high. So the risk is not change from recycled paper to chemical pulp, but the risk is availability of recycled paper. Most of container board made in Asia Pacific gets used to package various manufactured goods, which are then exported out of those countries and go somewhere else. So what that means is those boxes, the paper in those boxes, they had to come back to Asia Pacific mills in order to be reused. So these mills rely a lot on import of waste paper from various other countries. And the economics of that import, both in terms of collection in other countries and importing it, and the transportation costs and the logistics of doing that, that is where the risks may be. And that's what you need to identify. So if that risk is high, the recycle becomes more costly to import recycled container board from other countries, then you start looking at the viability of those mills. And here we're looking at container boards in Asia Pacific that depend on recycled paper. And there are a large number of small mills that you see that are in the high risk category, and those are the ones that the cost of acquiring the recycled paper goes high, then some of these mills definitely will be at risk of shutting down, and we see that happening. The larger mills that are low risk, obviously they can have a lot better leverage in terms of importing or sourcing, and that's what the future would be. So this is one way to look at or identifying risks for the container board mills. So obviously you need to identify the factors, primary factors for the risks for that grade, and then combine that with the viability analysis of benchmarking, and that's one way we can use this properly. Okay, so that's my brief look at the risks in paper industry for different grades. Now briefly look at what else can viability do. We can do some detailed analysis. There are multiple factors that we use, so you can just use two of them. In this case, I'm looking at cost and technical age, and my peer group is coated ground machines in North America. And the higher the number, higher the risk for cost or technical age. So anything in the top right-hand corner would be the highest risk. And look what we have. The Verso boxboard machines are the ones at the top right-hand corner. So if one would have looked at this graph before their closure, then that would have been an obvious choice for closure based on the cost and the technical age. And in Fisher-Salt, you can do this kind of analysis for any of those variables on the y-axis and any of the other variables on the x-axis, or any combination of them. The other possibility is for the financial institutions, competitiveness of companies. Here I'm looking at simply publicly traded companies, so we can sort those out compared to the private companies and see who, as a company, who is more viable. And based on that, you can make financial decisions, either in terms of investing or loaning money, or determine the conditions for investing. And obviously, this can be broken down by region or a country or whatever. So the peer group obviously needs to be identified. But in this is really a broader picture of all publicly traded companies all over the world. Another fairly complicated analysis one can do is very important for the vendors. And here, based on the other data in the Fisher-Salt, we can, for a vendor, can identify the potential clients, can identify or determine how big that client is in terms of how big an order we can get from it based on their size and capacity and what they make and all that thing. So here, the bubbles here, the diameter of the bubble represents the size of the market at a given site, at a paper mill site, for a particular vendor. And in this case, I won't name who the vendor is, but this is only for illustration. So you can do this. So the size of an order, potential order, is proportional to the size of the diameter. So you can see who the large customers are and the small customers are. But you combine that with viability and then prioritize in terms of who are going to be the good customers and who are not as good customers in terms of finally getting paid for whatever you're supplying. And that is very important for the equipment vendors, because there's a long lead time between when the order is placed and manufactured, installed, commissioned, and being completely paid by the customer. So obviously, the vendor needs to make sure that the customer is viable, is going to be around by the time all the work is done, and then they'll get paid appropriately. So here, you can use other tools in Fisher-Salt to not only to identify who the potential customers are, how big they are likely to be, but also how viable they are in terms of their long-term survival. In addition to the 8 factors, we can use some advanced features. And here in this instance, typically do a comparison by regional because most of the marketing is done regionally for most grades, but something like a market pulp, the market can be global. In that case, you need to go global comparison. You can also do an economic scenario where the currency of a country is strong against a dollar or weak against a dollar, and that can have impact for that particular country. So if that's what we are looking at in terms of determining the viability, then this is possible to do that as well. And transportation is an important cost item. So if comparing competitiveness to a specific destination in the world, so how competitive a particular mill or machine is in terms of delivering to a specific destination, then you can choose that destination. Obviously, you add the transportation cost to that destination to your production cost, and that way you can do a proper comparison. All other factors remain the same. So those are some additions you can make to fine-tune the viability analysis or very specific cases. So this is simply a summary of all the factors that I discussed, all the 8 factors listed on the top, possible destinations that you can use for different locations around the world, economic scenarios, geographic comparisons. So in conclusion, you can say that the viability analysis can be a very powerful tool. It is possible to identify at-risk machines, but you have to make the comparison by grade, and you got to define your peer group properly. So if it is a grade, a region, or a country, or a group of countries, whatever the market is for that grade, that has to be done. Otherwise, the analysis may not mean much. For grades such as market pulp, it's the global competitiveness that becomes important, and then you need to look at the other factors and do the comparison globally rather than regionally. Raw material shortage, because that can be a risk factor. We discuss in terms of either recycled paper or a market pulp. So either a shortage or abundance, we can look at it both ways and then determine the viability based on that. So knowing that, one can do a viability analysis. Can use it for investment decisions for financial institutions, just by knowing the financial health of a company. And for vendors, selecting appropriate clients. And bottom line for the vendors is the probability of getting paid for the vendors. So probability of getting paid by the producers to the vendors. So that's going to be important. So hopefully that answered most of the questions or the curiosity that the listeners have, and I'll be glad to answer any other questions that you may have. Thank you. Thank you for your time.